Hi everyone, my name is Zuhaib. Welcome to the Creating and Managing Grids tutorial, in which I am going to show you how to create and manage grids and how to control their properties using the controller. Creating a grid is easy, and all you need are some selected items in the Project or Layers panel. And click on Create Grid button. You can confirm some settings by going into this Grid Settings dialog. We come to this shortly. It doesn't matter if these items have different sizes. You can always set their fitting from here. You can choose different layer types to create a grid, but these should have a valid video source. Some of these are text and shape layers, composition, video footages, images, etc. When a new grid is created, it will have a unique ID as a prefix in its name, so it can be detected easily. The order of these layers will be the same as you have selected in the Layers panel. The Project panel items order doesn't matter. You can also change this order later using the Swap Selected Layers function inside the Additional Utilities dialog. The grid consists of different layers, which include the controller layer, feature layers, and item layers. On the controller layer, you will find presets to control the whole grid and its feature layers. The stroke layers will have a stroke for the item below it. The mask layer will have a mask for the grid layer below it and is used as a track mat to crop any extra pixels of grid items exceeding the grid frames. Then we have a background layer that will contain both backgrounds that we can add behind each grid item. We can choose if we want to add both or one at a time based on the requirement. Also, if you have enabled pre-comping for grid items, then you will find the new pre-comped items in the project panel under HEComps in a new folder with a unique grid ID in its name. Now, as we have discussed the grid intro, let's create a new grid to discuss the settings inside the grid settings dialog. I create a simple grid with 9 items in it and will add more to it later. Let me adjust some settings to create this grid. I am setting the items fitting option to stretch so they can fill the whole frame. This is just to visualize the grid frames without any gaps around the items. But I will discuss all these fitting options later while discussing these controls. It has all the basic options to create a grid, but we can also adjust these all even after creating the grid from the grid controls on the controller layer. The first option is Distribute In, which sets the distribution of items in rows or columns. Then we can choose how many number of items we want in a row or column. The next option is Frame Size, but we actually need to know about the frame first. When we create a grid, it generates frames like cells in Excel and will distribute the items inside these frames. All frames have same sizes as we set here or later in the grid controls preset, but items can have different sizes than their frames. And by using any of the fitting options, we can fit the item inside its frame, as we already did by stretching the items to fit within their frames. Later we will see how we can add features like masks, strokes, and backgrounds around these frames. So the first option is Auto Frame Size, which will get the frame size based on the maximum or minimum size found in all items. If you want to use a custom frame size value, then disable Auto Frame Size and put your desired frame size here. These all are changeable later from the grid controls. You can use custom size to distribute and fit items in a composition perfectly without leaving any gaps. So let's say you want 3 items in a row and 3 in a column, and your composition size is 1920 by 1080. So to get the exact frame size, you can divide the composition width, which is 1920, by the number of items in a row, which was 3. This way we get 640 for frame width, and do the same for height by dividing composition height, which was 1080, by the number of items you need in a column. So we got these values 640 by 360 for a single frame, and all frames now fit perfectly inside the composition with their items. If your items are not fitting properly within its frame, then you may need to use any fitting option from this menu. By enabling Precomp Selected checkbox, the items will be pre-comped before these were added to the grid, and it will use the settings that are saved in the Precomp Settings dialog. You can change these settings by clicking this Precomp Settings button or from the Precomp Settings dialog on the main UI. You can also precomp grid items later easily using the precomp function on the main UI. It will respect grid items and handle all its controls and expressions automatically. To learn more about all settings in the Precomp Settings dialog, check out its dedicated tutorial video that is also available on the product page. In the same way, you can use Add Frame Features checkbox to add frame features that we have discussed above, like masks, strokes, and backgrounds, and you can also add or remove these later as well. You can check what frame features are going to add by clicking Select Features button, which will open the Frame Features dialog that is same as the one on the main UI and shares the same settings. The next and last option in this panel is Selection From. Here you can let your script know where your selected items are to create the grid from. Are they in the Project panel or Layers panel? So let's create another grid. I hide this existing grid for now. I select some items from the Project panel this time and click on Create Grid button. I am setting the items fitting option to stretch and will discuss it shortly. There is a second function, Add to Grid, inside the Create Grid button that you can use to add additional items to the grid. The only settings which you need to check for this are Selection From to tell whether your new items to add belong to the Project or Layers panel, and the other one is Precomp Selected checkbox to precomp these before adding to the grid if needed. All other settings, including frame features, these new items will get from the existing grid. This is the same button as this one on the main UI. So for example, we want to add these 3 items to the grid from the Project panel. Make sure Project is selected here as well and click on Create Grid button by holding Ctrl or Command key. You can see all selected items have been added to the existing grid. You can even add items in a grid from another grid, and it works the same way by selecting any layer from the main grid first in which we want to add items, and then any items from the other grid. Let's change the selection panel to layers this time. It will ask that items belonging to another grid are found, and if would you like to duplicate these, you can click yes to continue. To remove any item, just select it with its feature layers and press delete, or go to the additional utilities dialog to release these layers. So now, as we have discussed all the settings for creating and adding items to the grid, let's have a look now at the grid controls preset added to the controller layer to manage this grid. For now, we have a single preset here for controlling the grid, but later when we will add the frame features, it will have another preset control here to control those features. The first setting is Distribute By, which is the same as we have checked before in the grid settings dialog, but we can change it here as well to rows or columns if we want. If we select rows, then the grid will flow from left to right, having 3 items in a row. But if we set it to columns, then it will flow from top to bottom, having these 3 items in a column instead of rows. You may notice if we change the number of items using this slider, then these will animate due to the floating number value, and this is kept this way on purpose, in case you want to animate these. But if you want the exact position, then type the number here without any decimals. Then we have fitting options for the overall grid, and this is different from this other one which is fitting for the items inside their frames. We come to these later. The first one is Fit by rows. It will fit the grid to the composition's width, and columns can still go outside of the composition from the bottom. You can see if we change the frame size or number of items, it will always fit to the composition's width and the columns will scale proportionally. In the same way Fit by columns works, that will fit the grid vertically by its columns to the composition height, and widths of the items and frames will scale proportionally. The items can now flow outside the composition from right. Then we have Fit rows and columns, which means even if we change the number of rows and columns, or change the frame size, the grid will always remain inside the composition boundary by scaling the items and frames proportionally. It can go outside the composition boundary if we change values for offset, scale, and position properties to animate the grid later. But if you select scale manually, then it means you have now exact frame sizes in pixels without any scaling. So each grid frame size is now 1920 by 1920. Note the item size, as the items will fit inside these frames according to their separate fitting option from here. I set it to columns for now, so the columns can fit to the composition's height and rows can flow from sides. The next properties are offset X and Y alternate, which means each next row or column will go in the opposite direction than the previous one. This is helpful to create slideshow animations. Let's animate these, but first I change the number of items to 4 and set the frame size to just show 3 items in a row inside the composition by dividing composition width by 3. And the same way 3 items in a column by dividing composition height with 3 items. Now we need to position the grid to the center using this position slider. So the rows can fill gaps on both sides while offsetting these. Then I add a keyframe for offset X and set its value in negative direction to set a start point. So now as a start point is set, add another keyframe at 3 seconds and adjust offset X in the other direction. You can see how rows are offsetting. Then we have margins to add margins between the frames in pixels. If you have enabled uniform margin checkbox, then margin X will control both margins. If you disable this, then you can control both margins X and Y separately. As we have added some margins, it affected the overall size of the frames and changed its position. So we need to increase the frame width and change offset values a bit. Let's adjust the frame settings and see what fit best. Then adjust offset value so all items align properly. And then adjust the position to move the whole grid to the center. I'm trying to find the best balance by playing around with these values. Copy the same offset value and paste it here and remove minus to reverse it. The next property is zoom to comp. This is extremely helpful to zoom any individual item to the composition even when the grid is animating. You can zoom any slide from your slideshow. Let's say we want to animate this item. I check its index first in its index calculation property, which is 7. Let's put it here. Now add one keyframe for zoom with 0 value and a second after 15 frames with the value of 100 for the fully zoomed item. Also duplicate these both and reverse to reset the zoom value. Adding some basic easing. You can see even though the grid is animating, the zoomed item will stay in the center when it is fully zoomed. You also need to convert the grid layers to 3D, so the zoomed layer will always stay on top of the other layers. You can do this manually or use this option in the additional utilities dialog. Now you can see it will always stay on the top no matter what grid item index you use. Let's continue with the next property group, which is frame size and fitting. where we can adjust the size of the frames and choose how the items should fit inside the grid frames. As we already know that all the grid frames have same sizes, but the items don't. The items we add to the grid are just centered on these invisible frames with their actual sizes. The items can also scale with their frames, as the frames can be scaled if you use any of the grid fitting options. Before, I had set it to stretch temporarily, so these always fit inside their frames properly. But now let's check these in detail, and I'm going to add the stroke frame feature to demonstrate that. So now if we set the grid fitting option to scale manually, then you can see we are seeing frames with exact 663 by 360 size. I show rulers to check, but first change the playhead where the item is aligned with the composition edge. You can see it is 663 pixels. If you set here to 500 for size X and 500 for size Y, need to change the time again where the item is properly aligned to the edge, as changing the frame size affects the positioning. You can see it is exactly 500 pixels in width and in height as well in the grid fitting option scale manually. In other options, these frame sizes work more as ratios between both values because these frames are scaled to fit within the composition. But these will be 500 pixels by 500 pixels perfectly if we set it to scale manually again. If we now set the items to no fitting, I make these layers solo to show. So now you can see items are just centered to their frames with no fitting and with their default 100% scale. I hope now the concept of the frame is clear, and setting the grid fitting back to fit columns. And set the frame sizes back to 663 by 360 pixels. Now we go through these items fitting options one by one, starting from fill the frame. It will fill the whole frame by scaling proportionally, and the areas that go outside the frame will get clipped if you have added the mask frame feature. The next fitting option is fit to frame, which will fit the item inside its frame boundary by scaling it proportionally. If the width and height of the item are not proportionally equal to the frame's width and height, then it will introduce some empty area there. Then we have fit by width, which will fit the item by its width to the frame's width and will scale the height proportionally. The next one is fit by height, which will fit the item by its height to the frame's height and will scale the width proportionally. Then we have stretch to fit, which will stretch the item's width and height to fit within its frame perfectly, and it won't maintain the proportions. The last one is no fitting, that we already checked, and it will just reset the scale to 100% default for each item. I need to change back to scale manually to get exact size, and you can see here I set it back to fit columns. So now we have covered all fitting options, and I can remove the stroke frame feature. I will add the mask frame feature instead to clip the items if they go outside the frame boundary, which we have seen before when they went outside the stroke boundary. Now if we choose any fitting option, the extra pixels won't show. Let's continue to the next property group, which is transform and animate. To better explain that, let's create another grid using pictures of some animals and birds, but you can use anything you like. It could be pictures or icons of people. I am setting the number of items to 4 and adding the mask and stroke frame features. Now click on create grid button. Let's adjust some settings from the grid controller. Set fitting options to fit rows and set the items fitting option to fill the frame. In the frame X and Y sizes, use the same value to create square frames. These sizes won't matter in grid fitting options other than scale manually. These will behave more like a ratio for width and height, while the fitting option is set to fit by rows, columns or both. Introduce some margins. Now position the whole grid to the center. Then round the corner for these by going into frame features controls. I'm not going into details of these controls for now. Also, let's adjust the stroke color, increase the expansion, and add some dashes from its dashes settings. So now our grid is ready to test out these transform and delay properties. You can change the values for the transform properties like position, scale, rotation, and opacity. We also have a uniform scale checkbox that will link both scale values with a single scale X slider. All of the transform properties can be animated with or without delays. Let's add some keyframes on the rotation property. I add one here and set its value to 90 degrees. Then add second after some frames with 0 value. Now if you play, you can see all the grid items are rotating individually at the same time. But now if we set the delay in frames value to 3, which means each item will rotate with 3 frames delay from its previous item. So now if you play, you can see how the items are rotating with the delay this time. Adding some basic easing. The delay is enabled on all of these transform properties, but if you don't want to affect any transform property, then disable it from here. Now let's discuss the delay methods available in delay by. The first one is sequentially, which means all grid items will get delayed according to their grid indices. The first item index is 1 and will increment with each next item in the grid. So each item will get delayed by this number of frames from its previous item. We can reverse the item sequence by enabling reverse delay direction checkbox. So this way delay will be calculated from the last item moving backward to the first item in the grid. You can see if we play now, then the first item will animate at the end. I disable it again and let's check the other delay by option, which is delay by distance. With this option, the items will get delayed by their distance from this delay center point. So if the items are closer to this point, they won't delay or delay less, but as the items go far from this point, they will be more delayed. So let's set the delay center point here and see how it works. Let's increase the frame delay by 6 to make it more noticeable. You can see how the delay is progressing from the top left now, and if it is in the center, then all items will start animating from the center. The reverse delay direction checkbox works the same here, and when enabled, the items that are further away from the delay center point would delay less or have no delay, and as they get closer, their animation will be delayed more. You may not see much as the number of items are less, that's why I have this composition with more items and animated the scale of these. Now if you play, you can see how the animation is progressing from the center moving towards the edges. This is without reversing its direction. Setting area to next set of keyframes, and this is with reverse delay direction enabled. I just keyframed reverse delay direction here. You need to keep it away from keyframes on both sides that are still animating, because it will be affected immediately if reverse delay direction is changed at that point. Now if you play, you can see the animation is progressing from outwards to inwards according to the delay center point. Same way if we change it to sequential, move the keyframes a bit further as the previous keyframes delay animation is overlapping here. You can see it is starting in reverse direction as well. You can create cool effects and transitions using these delays. Go back to previous composition. We can also animate multiple transform properties with a delay at the same time. Let's check that as well. I set it back to sequentially. Set delay in frames to 2 and add keyframes to scale, rotation and opacity. I move these to start and add a second keyframe above the rotation keyframe. On first keyframe, I am setting the scale to 0. I need to enable scale with item checkbox so the frames can also scale with their items. Now set the opacity from 0 to 100. Add some easing. Let's see how the animation looks. We can also animate grid position with delays. Let's add some keyframes to this too. On the first keyframe, I set its value to -x direction and adding the basic easing. Now check again. These keyframes can start at different times in the timeline as well. Let's move the rotation keyframes a bit further. So first other properties will get animated with delays and then the rotation will start. You can see how easily we made all items appear in the scene with delays in this simple example. You can play around with these further. So now, as we have discussed all the grid settings, dialog options and grid controller properties, we didn't discuss much about the grid frame features to keep the tutorial as short as possible. But you can check the dedicated tutorials for adding frame features and additional utilities on the product page, and also some others to learn more about other panels and functionalities of the script. You can reach out for any further queries or help. That was it for this tutorial and I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching and see you later.